Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about books that I have recently finished reading. I read both of these books back in July. I am recording this at the beginning of August, and I have two science fiction books. One of them, well, I read them for two different reasons, but I decided in July to have my own sort of sci-fi July event. I know Michael K. Vaughn, who has a great channel, he had been hosting an event called Rocket Summer, where people were reading classic science fiction. I really didn't have any classic science fiction on hand to read, but I did have some works on my shelves, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to devote July to at least getting through some of them. And I decided on Ender's Game and Redshirts, which I buddy read with Dave over the book Blather. I'll talk about this one second. So Ender's Game. I've had this on my shelf for so long. I think somebody gave this to me to read, I'm embarrassed to say, probably like 20 years ago. And this mass market paperback has just been kind of sitting around on shelves, floating around for a long time. I also decided to do, one of the things that's going around booktube is the banned books reading. What I had done in the beginning of the year, I look at the banned books, and we say banned books, we're talking about books that have been challenged a lot. And this one popped up. I looked at the list and I said, and I just saw what was on my shelf that I haven't read yet that is on those lists, and this was one of them. So I decided this is going to be one of the 10 books that I had gotten together that I'm going to read, and figured, hey, you know, Sci-Fi July, might as well get through this one. I have, of course, heard of this for a long time. Like I said, the friend that recommended this to me was very enthusiastic about it. It's been decades. And I knew a little bit going in, as far as like, I knew there's a twist at the end that I knew about. And I just kind of knew that from, you know, cultural osmosis. I didn't see the film adaptation they did of this. But I just kind of knew what the end was. And so I knew a little bit about this story going in, but there was still a lot that I really didn't know. And I have seen so many people praise this. You know, if you just do a YouTube search of Ender's Game book review, you're going to see people say, you know, you're going to see things like, you know, one of the greatest science fiction novels ever, and people fawning over it and loving it. And I think a lot of those people probably read it when they were young. I'm usually pretty good, and I think I was successful this time, about going into books without too many expectations. You know, I don't usually get disappointed if things are overhyped to me. So that's all to say, you know, kind of as a little bit of a caveat here. I read it and I thought it was okay. I wish I liked it as much as a lot of other people, you know, seem to have gotten out of it. If I had read this when I was 13, I probably would have really, really liked it. But of course I read it when I was 43, and it's not quite the same. It does very much read to me like a young adult novel. I don't know if that was on purpose necessarily. I will say that I am a reader who, the majority of my reading is generally like nonfiction, especially things like history. Maybe 10 to 20% of my reading is fiction, and I don't read a lot of science fiction. I do read Star Trek fiction. That's one of my summer traditions. I am the creator of a booktube event called Book Trek, where we read Star Trek fiction. Me and a bunch of other great co-hosts do that every year. And I've read some science fiction, and even though I like science fiction, it's just not my kind of go-to genre to read all the time. So, you know, take that for what it is. You know, you're not talking to somebody who's like read tons of sci-fi and is just like a diehard sci-fi book fan. Now, this follows a young boy, very young in the beginning, I think he's like 6 years old, who is kind of this prodigy who is chosen by the government to go into space and to train to be a military officer, because they have had two different wars with aliens that are kind of bug-like. And sorry if my memory is not super fresh. I read this about a month ago, and you know, my videos are unscripted and just kind of off the cuff. And I don't know if I said this in the very beginning, but don't consider this a review. This is just a discussion. We follow him throughout the years as he is training. We see him overcome a lot of bullies. There does seem to be a lot of kind of revenge fantasy stuff going on in here. Him always kind of giving bullies, their comeuppances. And there's also this kind of subplot with his older brother and sister and what's going on with them on Earth at the time. So uh, there was some interesting ideas in here, absolutely. The writing itself didn't really hook me. The subplot with the brother and sister, where they essentially, this is going to be mostly spoiler review. Sorry, spoiler free talk. I do have to talk about a few things though. Like the brother and sister, how they kind of start blogging themselves into power. This was published before the internet, and he does anticipate the internet, which is pretty cool. But it's not very believable the way that we see them sort of write these essays and gain a bunch of power. I really didn't. Didn't really like that subplot too much. And we follow Ender, and one of my criticisms, this is kind of a very chosen one type story. Ender comes across sometimes, minor opposition. It doesn't matter, because no matter what he comes up against, he's going to overcome it, and you start figuring that out pretty quickly. And he pretty much is awesome at everything. I think that's one of the problems I have with this, is that we don't see like normal kids. These kids are all supposed to be geniuses, so I don't know if that's an excuse to have no kid actually seem like a kid. Sometimes, like I said, Ender is like 6 years old. He doesn't act like a 6-year-old. None of the other people that he's with that are supposed to be 6-year-old act like 6-year-olds. So, I had a harder time connecting with this story. In the end, there was an interesting twist. I thought that the way that the aliens were depicted was actually really interesting. And the ending was intriguing, not enough to really make me want to continue on with this series. I know there's ones that come after this. And I've seen some people really praise the second one, but I'm just not as interested, I guess, in this world as a lot of people are. So I thought it was okay. One of those things, glad I read. But I just don't have it as high on my list as a lot of other people seem to. So that was Ender's Game. And I also had read this towards the second half of July. And I did a buddy read with Dave over at the book Blather. He's a really nice guy. Definitely check out his channel. He does read a lot more sci-fi than I do. I think it's one of his bread and butter. He reads tons of sci-fi, vintage sci-fi, collects the old paperbacks. He gets some fun books with some great covers on them. And we decided to read this together. We both had this on our list. And one of the reasons I read this was for Book Trek 2024. What I mentioned before, Book Trek is an annual event. It's been each summer now for the past 4 years, where we read Star Trek fiction. But there are also some optional away missions. One of them is to read nonfiction science. And the other away mission, optional, is to read books related to Trek. Books that really wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Trek. And that can be parodies, pastiche, other types of pastiche, not exactly just Trek fiction. It could even be like things like, actors' biographies or production history, that sort of thing. So I've had this on my shelf for a few years. I was going to read it for Book Trek last year, but just didn't get around to it. So finally got around to it this time. I know some people really, really like this. One of my co-hosts, Gareth, my Book Trek co-host, I think he really loves this one. And I knew going into it that it wasn't like a straight parody. I knew that there was something else going on. I didn't know exactly what all of that was. But if you don't know, Redshirts basically refers to the idea, I guess it's sort of true. In the original series, whenever there was an away mission, if there was a crew member who had a red shirt on who didn't have a name, or they've just been introduced or something like that, they were probably going to die. They Kirk would make it back, but the red shirt would die. So it kind of became a running gag, and that has a bearing on this. That's definitely what the beginning of the book is about, but it does change. It ends up being a story much more meta in nature. And I think Dave and I don't want to speak for him, but we were talking back and forth on Voxer. We seem to have very similar reactions to this book, which is to say, in the end, we were both kind of like, it was okay. I think we both really liked the ideas that were present. And I don't want to get spoilery, because there are some hard left turns that are taken inside this book. And I think if you're going to read it, it's best that you discover those on your own. So I really don't want to get too spoilery. I'm going to try and be vague as far as plot details. And those things were great. We did both sort of have an issue with the writing. It's one of those books. It's even within the first couple pages. You see dialogue, and it's, so and so said, the so and so said, so and so said, so and so said, so and so said, and I've like seen like writing advice where they say, yeah, just put that, and the reader kind of won't even notice it. I always notice it, and it's especially noticeable with this because oftentimes, even if only two characters are speaking, you constantly have to have the so and so said, so and so said, so and so said after a piece of dialogue. It gets kind of distracting. And at the same time, though, it almost feels a little bit necessary because the characters, especially in the first half of the book, are not very distinct. There's not a lot to really separate them in your mind. And we have two characters like Dahl and Duvall, which are very close sounding. I wish that this story had more, I guess I would say, like descriptive language. It doesn't go into much about, it doesn't do much to like set up the environment, to build the world, to give us a lot of sensory input, to let us know what characters are doing while they're speaking. It's just a lot of people speaking. So it ends up being kind of, it has a feeling of being almost like rushed, as you're being like thrown through the story. And the story was intriguing enough where I wanted to keep going, but it wasn't the writing that was doing it. It was really the story that did it. I felt like it felt like a story that if there was like one more pass through, there were so many opportunities to kind of push things further to make it even better. And I can't talk too much about that because, or the ideas I have, because I think it would be too spoilery. That I just kind of wish, like, oh man, like, that if you just, added this little thing or done that, there's so much potential there. And I try not to think of things too much in that way, but I can't help it when I'm reading things like this because there's so much left off the page, like I said, in a writing sense. There's just tons of dialogue. In the end, I enjoyed the story itself. I thought it was all right. And the other thing about it, the writing, is that it's trying really hard to be funny. And I would call it humorous and not necessarily funny. I mean, I smiled a few times, but for the most part, the humor, and I'm not a humorless person, it was just kind of like that funny, unfunny type of writing. It was trying too hard for certain jokes, and sometimes when a joke would come across, it would kind of like push it just a little bit too far, where it's kind of like, I get it, just move on, I get it. I figured out the joke. It's not like the kind of like comedic timing that you can find in really funny books. And then the story ends, and then you get it, but it's not done. We have codas. After the story ends, we get the first coda. There's coda 1, 2, and 3. It's first person, second person, and third person. And I gotta admit, once I kind of finished the story, and then I got to that coda first person, I just didn't really feel like continuing. I did continue. And Dave said that he kind of felt the same way. He said it felt like having reading hangover, where he just kind of wanted to push through. And that first person coda, it's related to this story, but I just was not enjoying it. I don't know if I was just kind of wanting the story to be over, or it's a lot of that kind of funny, unfunny writing. And it just seemed like too long and overindulgent. And then we get the coda to second person and third person. Without going into specifics about what they were about, I liked those better. They were more thoughtful, they were more philosophical, and they had elements in the story that I kind of wish were in the main story. So coda 2 and 3, I didn't mind reading nearly as much. So in the end, I didn't love it. I thought it was okay. I kind of wanted this to be more of a love letter to Trek. Obviously, this wouldn't exist without Trek, but it's not really. It mentions Star Trek explicitly, but there's also another show that exists in this book's world called like Chronicles of the Intrepid, and that's supposed to be a like Trek ripoff that's poorly written. And that's the world in which we see these our character Redshirts existing in. But the thing is, like, they talk about how bad the writing is and how stupid the stories are, but they're still basically talking about Trek. There wasn't a lot really to. If you read this, I don't think you would come away thinking that Trek was all that good, unfortunately. So, I have kind of a meh reaction to this. Wish I liked it more. Wish I liked both of these more, honestly. Ender's Game's not a bad book. It just wasn't necessarily, for me. So yeah, I'm kind of middle of the road for both of these. Again, if you're somebody who loves Ender's Game, and especially, I'm really curious for the people who love this book, what age they were when they read it. I can see somebody younger reading this, like I'm talking like tween or early teens, and like really getting a lot more out of it, maybe connecting with the character more. But especially if you were an adult who read this and you love it, I'd just be curious to know why, like what it was about this book that you really liked. If you have other thoughts that are different from mine about this one, I'd be curious to know what those are, of course, in a respectful manner. So yeah, that's it. We've got Ender's Game and Redshirts. As always, thank you, BookTube.